In this video, we're going to look at section 2.2, which is about measurement. So if you think about measurement, there's lots of ways of measuring the same thing. For example, we're going to talk about length down here. There's lots of ways that we can measure length. We can measure it in inches, feet, miles, meters, or kilometers. In the United States, we think about inches, feet, and miles usually in yards, where someone in France or in Europe would use the metric system. Actually, in almost every other place in the world, they would use the metric system, and they would use meters and kilometers. So the system we use something called imperial units, and like I said, in almost every other country, they're going to use the metric system. So if we can measure length with any of these units, that would mean that there's some way to convert between any of these units. There's some way to convert between inches and miles, between feet and miles, between miles and meters, between miles and kilometers. Any two of these units we could pick, and there's some conversion factor. So some common conversion factors that you probably know are feet to inches, right? 12 inches is in a foot. You might not know exactly how many feet are in a mile, but this is a common conversion. 5,280 feet are in a mile. As far as like what your instructor might want you to have memorized, that would be something to ask your instructor. For me, I like my students to know there's 12 inches in a foot, there's 3 feet in a yard. Any of the conversions that go from an imperial unit to the metric system, I don't require that my students know what those are. And actually, this should be an approximation sign right here as well. Any of the conversions between the metric system and the imperial units are going to be approximations. If you're working within the imperial unit to another imperial unit, it's going to be an exact conversion. 3 feet is exactly 1 yard. Same thing in the metric system. It's going to be exact. 1,000 meters is exactly 1 kilometer. But when we're talking about converting between the metric system and imperial unit, then it's going to be an approximation. 1 mile is approximately 1.61 kilometers. And there's more decimals after that if you need more accuracy for whatever you're measuring. So the next thing we want to do is think about some other things that we can measure besides length. And we've got some hints up here in these commonly used conversions. These units up here are all length, but we get down to here and we get pounds, ounces, tons. What does that measure? Well, that measures weight, right? So let's put that in our chart. So we'll put weight is something we can measure. And what are some units that are used to measure weight? Well, we've got some examples up here. We could measure weight in pounds. We could measure weight in ounces. We could measure weight in tons. We could, I should just put ton instead of pluralizing these, but that's okay. Any other ones you could think of? What about the metric system? How do we measure weight in the metric system? Over here, right, we've got ounces to grams. So ounces measures weight, so therefore grams would also measure weight. All right, there's not going to be a conversion between pounds and inches because they measure different things. So since there's a conversion between ounces and grams, that means they measure the same thing. Kilograms and pounds, so we could put kilograms here as well. And there's a lot of other ways to measure weight, but these are the most common ways to measure weight. Milligrams would be another one in the metric system that you probably have heard of before. All right, what else do we have here? Well, we have gallons, quarts, tablespoons, teaspoons, cups. Those all kind of go together. Those are basically measuring volume or liquid volume, but usually liquid volume when you're talking about quarts and gallons, but you know, you could have a gallon of sand, I suppose. Teaspoons and tablespoons. Let's call it volume. So we've got gallons. Let's call it liquid volume because we're going to distinguish some other volume later. We'll just put this in parentheses here. Cooking, things like that. Quarts, tablespoons, I'm going to abbreviate that like that. Teaspoon, I'm going to abbreviate like that. Cups. Okay, so we could convert between cups and tablespoons. Like if I had a cup of flour, that's 16 tablespoons of flour. If I had a tablespoon of flour, that would be 3 teaspoons of flour. So with this information right here, we should be able to figure out how many teaspoons are in a cup, even though it's not in our chart. And that's something that we're going to be working on later on. But what I would like you to do now is think of some other things that you can measure that are maybe not in this chart. What are some other things you can measure besides length, weight, and volume? Why don't you pause the video and do a little brainstorming and see what you can come up with. Did you come up with time? That's something that we measure. Running out of time. How do we measure time? What are some units of measurement for time? Well, we could start with a small unit of measurement like a second. And then we could go to minutes, hours, days, months, years. Right? These are all measurements of time. How about temperature? We could measure the temperature. There's really only 2 common ones. Oh boy, I'm not going to be able to know how to spell Fahrenheit. All right, I cheated a little bit and asked the device. So Fahrenheit and Celsius. Celsius is another common one. If you take science classes, you may do Kelvin. But there's a way to convert between Fahrenheit and Celsius. If I tell you the Fahrenheit temperature, there's a little formula to figure out what the Celsius temperature is, and we'll probably look at that later. Maybe some of you came up with area. Right? We could measure area. We measure area in square feet or square units. I'm just picking square feet as one possibility. I'm going to write it out like that, but you might also see it written like SQFT for square feet, or you might see it written feet squared. Okay, that doesn't mean that you're going to square the number of square feet you have. This just means square feet. You could also measure in square inches, square centimeters. As a matter of fact, any of these lengths up here, squared, would be a measurement that you could use, a unit that you could use to measure area. Okay, square kilometers. Same thing with volume. Same kind of idea with volume, except we would measure in cubic units. So for example, we would measure in cubic feet, which we could abbreviate as CU, feet, or more commonly in mathematics, you're going to see feet to the 3rd power, and we would read that as cubic feet. So similarly, any of these lengths, cubed, cubic inches, cubic centimeters, cubic kilometers, cubic miles, would measure volume. And we'll be talking more about volume and area in later sections. Let's see, we might have room for one more. Maybe some of you came up with speed, how fast something's going. That's something we can measure. So the most common way we measure speed is in miles per hour. But we could also do feet per second. Or maybe we're measuring how fast a glacier is receding. So maybe that's in inches per year. So you'll notice this is a rate, right? This is literally a rate. It's something divided by something else. It's a unit divided by unit. And if we look at the units in the numerator, miles, feet, and inches, those are all lengths. These are all lengths from up here. And the units in the denominator, hours, second, and years, those are all units of time. So if you take any length, let's take any length divided by any unit of time, any unit of length divided by any unit of time, you're going to get a unit of speed. So measuring things, what's just as important as what you're measuring and the value of that measurement is the unit that you're using. You have to label your units and keep track of your units when you're measuring. So we're going to focus a little bit on these conversion rates up here. And we're going to start with this 1 mile is 5,280 feet. So in activity 2, it says in section 1.3, we defined rate as a ratio of two quantities with different units. So let's consider the unit conversion that 1 mile is equivalent to 5,280 feet. This conversion can be represented by the rate 1 mile to 5,280 feet. And since we can scale rates, we can scale this conversion. Let's take a look at that. So here we have a illustration of how 1 mile is equivalent to 5,280 feet. And this is a scaled version of the 1 mile. What's the scale factor there? This second diagram, what's the scale factor that we used on the first diagram to obtain the second diagram? Hopefully you see we just scaled it by 2, right? So we had this rate we were talking about, which was 1 mile to 5,280 feet. So let me write it up here. Let's say 1 mile to 5,280 feet. So if we scale this by a factor of 2, we get a new rate, which says that 2 miles to 10,560 feet. So 2 miles is equivalent to 10,560 feet. We could also scale this by a half. We'll write this in green. So if I scale this by a half, I get this third diagram down here, which is the fact that a half a mile is equal to a half of 5,280 feet, or 2,640 feet. So you can scale any of these rates to come up with new equivalencies. All right, let's take a look at number 1. So we had in our conversion chart that there are about 1.61 kilometers in 1 mile. And this is an illustration of that. So let's take a look at this illustration, make sure we understand it. So we're illustrating the distance from here to here is 1 kilometer, and here to here is 1.61 kilometers, which is equivalent to 1 mile. All right, so if a little guy was here, and he was, or gal, and running on the track, a little person, they would run to, if they ran to, this was the start, and this was the finish line, that distance is the same distance that person's covering, could be measured in miles or kilometers, 1 mile or 1.61 kilometers. So this gives us a visual. So scaling this 1.61 kilometers back, we're going to guess 1 kilometer is about right here. Right? A half a kilometer would be halfway between the start and the finish. We could guess that might be about right there. So half of 1.6 is about 0.8. Okay, so this would be about 1 kilometer right here. So go ahead and pause the video, and I would like you to answer questions A, B, and C. See if you can answer questions A, B, and C. And then we'll come back and talk about them after you've had a chance to think about it. Part A says, which unit of measurement is larger, a mile or a kilometer? Well, let's look at this diagram. Let's say this person didn't like running. Would they rather run a kilometer or a mile? A kilometer would take them to here, and a mile would take them to there. Well, a mile is farther away, right? So a mile is larger. It takes 1.61 kilometers to make 1 mile. So 1 mile is a longer distance. Using the figure above as a reference, draw 3 miles. About how many kilometers are in 3 miles? I'll just draw a line in here, and let's say that this represents 0 kilometers right here. I'll write that on the bottom. And let's say this is 0 miles here. And I want to draw 3 miles. Okay, so I'm going to draw out 3 miles. So this will be 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. And we can draw our kilometers on the bottom. Maybe we'll do that in a different color. Let's do red. So 0 kilometers. All right, well, I know 1 mile is 1.61 kilometers. So this distance right here is 1.61 kilometers. So 2 miles would be 1.61 plus 1.61. That would be 3.22 kilometers. So if I want to go another mile, I got to add another 1.61 kilometers, which I think is 4.83. That looks good. So about how many kilometers are in 3 miles? About 4.83 kilometers. Okay, C, use the figure above as a reference, draw a half a mile. About how many kilometers are in a half a mile? Well, let's use this same figure here. So a half a mile would be about here, right? About half a mile. So we could scale this down. And so I need to take half of 1.16, which I talked about. Actually, I drew that up here. Is about 0.8. If you did 1.61 divided by 2, you'd get 0.805, but which is about 0.8, right? It's asking about, so we can use this idea of scaling that we've been working on to help us with conversion factors. What I'd like you to do now is look at questions D and E, pause the video, and see if you can see what you come up with, and start the video when you're done. All right, let's take a look. We've got the diagram here, and so really what this is asking is for this question mark right here. What is the distance here in miles? About how many miles are in 1 kilometer? What would this be? Well, here's 1 mile, so it's got to be less than 1 mile, right? Let's see. How could we guesstimate? Maybe we'd figure out where a half is, or guess where a half a mile is. Like what's halfway between 0 and maybe right in here. I'm just guessing, right? I'm going to say that's about half, or 0.5. So I think it's more than a half. So from here, we're just going to guesstimate, I don't know, maybe 0.6. I mean, that seems reasonable, somewhere around 0.6. If you guess somewhere in there, that's a good guess. Okay, so now it says, and actually it's pretty accurate. If you Googled it or looked it up, I think it's 0.62 or something like that. Use the figure above as a reference, part E, and draw 2 kilometers. About how many miles are in 2 kilometers? Well, if we just scaled this, we got 1 kilometer to here. If we went out to 2 kilometers, out to here, 2 kilometers, then we would just double this 0.6. Maybe my scale is off. This is pretty good. Okay, so if from 0 to 1 kilometer right here is 0.6 miles, then I would need another 0.6 miles, which would take me to 1.2 miles. So it's about 1.2 miles. Whatever you put for part D, you should double it for your answer for part E. So again, really think about how we can use our conversion factors, write them as rates, and then use scaling to help us determine other values.